Welcome back after lunch. Thanks very much for a lovely lunch. And thanks also to Sue, Alex and Stuart for bringing us together today. I think we've all really appreciated the opportunity for the fellowship, break bread with people again. It's a real tonic. My name's Vijay Krishnan. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a relatively newcomer to the Commonwealth. I only spent 13 years at Marlborough House. If I look round the room, I can see many with greyer beards than mine. I was the Director General of the Commonwealth Foundation, the Commonwealth's agency for civil society. I served as the Deputy Director for 2 terms and then the Director General. I have had nothing to do with the Commonwealth for 3 years, since I stood down in June 2019. I've been going straight and really enjoying it, I have to tell you. There is life outside the institution, I can assure you, and I've really enjoyed it. But equally, I found it really uplifting being amongst friends and colleagues who share my passion for the institution and are prepared to put some thought and effort into where it should go next. The discussions so far, colleagues, have trailed the issue of Commonwealth values. There's also been a willingness in the discussion so far to interrogate those values, to ask the questions about how they're viewed, how they're articulated, how they're regulated. And we've noted the upcoming 10th anniversary of the Charter, and there's a debate as to whether it's aspirational or directive, and flagged the need for a conversation as to how the institution how it's doing in living up to those 16 clauses, and perhaps more importantly, how it can do better. The discussions today started with an acknowledgement that the Commonwealth is an institution, and I think that's an important distinction to make. Sometimes we slip into the shorthand of describing the Commonwealth as an organisation. I'd contest that. It's not an organisation. Rather, it's an institution, a construct, a system that relies on the interplay of different agencies, organisations, and indeed individuals, as I look around the room, that shape this thing and move it along together. And nowhere is that more apparent than in the discussion on values. And, we've touched a little bit on the role of the network of organisations in enabling the Commonwealth to live up to its values. So in this afternoon's session, it's perhaps fitting that the session draws on inputs from the network. We'll be hearing from William from the CJA and from Sneh from CHRI. The Commonwealth Journalists Association and the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative. On the issue of values, the issue of where you stand in relation to Commonwealth values also depends on where you sit. So I'm really happy that we also have a perspective from outside the immediate network, from a specifically Caribbean perspective. And that's where I'd like to start this afternoon's session with an intervention from Cynthia Barrow-Giles. Professor Giles served as the Deputy Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of the West Indies at the Cave Hill campus. She's the former head of the Department of Government Sociology and Social Work, and she's also authored and co-authored a number of books on Caribbean politics, on Caribbean sovereignty, on general elections, the practice and conduct of general elections in the English-speaking Caribbean, and she's also written on the role of women in Caribbean politics. She's participated in a number of election monitoring and expert groups in Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean region, and served as a member of the St. Lucia Constitution Reform Commission from 2005 and 2011. Through the miracles of the internet, Cynthia's now going to speak to us. Cynthia.
Good morning, or should I say good afternoon?
Good morning,
yes, I'm conscious of the fact that I'm 5 hours behind you. So it is morning here, but it is early afternoon in the UK. Thank you very much for that introduction, but primarily for your your sort of brief and I think very helpful overview of what has transpired so far. Thank you again for clarifying exactly what the Commonwealth is. For many of us, the Commonwealth is still very much an enigma. So I'm very pleased that I'm not quite sure if I agree, but I'm very pleased with that clarification. This afternoon or this morning, the core of my contribution will be on governance, of course, and the Commonwealth values. What exactly are these values, and are they sufficiently understood by both governments and the people, certainly with respect to the Caribbean, where I'm coming from? You said a while ago that the perspective of where people sit is very important. And I sit in the Caribbean, and therefore, of course, while I'm not ignoring what is taking place outside of the Caribbean, my focus has been and will continue to be primarily on the Caribbean. So I ask myself, is there really a consensus on these Commonwealth values, and should those stated values merely be extended within the Commonwealth itself in terms of our behaviors and policy positions? These are questions I ask, and hopefully we could get some discussions from it, because I would really like to benefit from people's perspective. So I would like to use this opportunity to address the issues of values largely from the perspective of the Caribbean, looking at the constitutional and other governance issues that we're experiencing, and for which the Commonwealth, and certainly its charter, speaks quite eloquently. A charter, of course, as has just been indicated, has codified decades-old practices and principles of the Commonwealth. And I do wonder whether, given these experiences and the silence of the experiences in the Caribbean, that is, and the silence of the Commonwealth, sometimes it appears to me on these developments that is suggestive of a lack of political will on the part of the institution. I had, of course, organization, I will change that, to deal with what the members themselves have in fact agreed ought to be pursued. My concern really relates to the meaning and perhaps elaboration given to some of these core values, and to the extent the extent to which they are internalized by member governments themselves. Many of these values, which member states are all theoretically committed to, are being undermined or in fact blatantly ignored by contracting parties to the Charter itself. Admittedly, the Commonwealth must be applauded for its many contributions across the Commonwealth space, and its technical and other support to members, its advocacy on several critical issues such as climate change, gender justice, and the strengthening of democratic governance, for instance. However, it does appear to me that the Commonwealth sometimes seems incapable of transmitting these core values to some of the political leaders within the Commonwealth Caribbean specifically, and certainly and the general population outside of a very small cross-section of the population. So therefore, as I contemplated the issues of values of the Commonwealth, it struck me that certainly from the perspective of the Caribbean, a minority of Caribbean people understand the purpose of the institution and the extent to which the institution has any meaning or saliency for the people of the region. While those of us who are gathered here would acknowledge that what is largely but clearly not solely a post-colonial grouping of UK and former British colonies, as I indicated, demonstrate in a very real sense some of the stated values of the institution in terms of the global stances that the institution has taken on grand issues such as democratic governance, justice, electoral equity, particularly with respect to its work on elections, its global youth policy from which the Caribbean appears to have benefited, its human rights agenda, and so on. It remains very clear, at least from a Commonwealth and wider English-speaking Caribbean perspective, that the Commonwealth is still very much, as I indicated a while ago, an enigma to many, and for some, seen as indeed irrelevant. I do think that I need to clarify this. To a certain extent, there is in some quarters in the Commonwealth Caribbean a false impression or understanding that the Commonwealth is predominantly about the monarchy and the perpetuation of empire. At least when I speak to people who are in very critical positions in the Caribbean, that is the impression that sometimes is in fact being conveyed of the understanding of the Commonwealth. And it is important to understand this from the vantage point of the English-speaking Caribbean. Indeed, as I indicated, this is a view held not merely by the uninitiated and uninformed, but by some highly educated and prominent persons in society, who often scoff at the idea of the Commonwealth, particularly as the Commonwealth is too often, I would admit, reduced to the UK empire and in fact the monarchy. In other words, in the popular imagination in the region, there is essentially no or little distinction between the British monarchy, the Crown as a titular head, and the association itself or the institution itself. Nor could the UK or Britain be detached from the idea of the Commonwealth itself. Largely because of that lack of understanding of the distinction, and given the confluence of developments today, including the demand for reparations in the Caribbean, the perception of the high-handedness of the British government towards the overseas territories in the region, the Windhoek scandal, and the continuing repatriation or deportation of Caribbean nationals, primarily Jamaicans. All of those things are in fact leading to a situation where there is increased, I would argue, tension and damage being done to the idea of the Commonwealth. And so this is leading to a questioning of the relevance of the Commonwealth itself and of the values of the Commonwealth by maybe not governments, but certainly by citizens. The issue of whether the Commonwealth has any redeeming or enduring value to its membership, and certainly beyond governments to the people of the various regions, is something that must be taken up by the institution. And so what I'm suggesting, because I don't really have answers to those issues, is that some further introspection at this juncture is definitely required. That is, of course, not to dispute that many of us believe that the Caribbean has benefited in both tangible and non-tangible ways from the Commonwealth of Nations. The bonds between the Commonwealth and the Caribbean, because of the long unbroken exposure we essentially have had to Britain, have resulted in very strong cultural, psychic, political, and economic ties, and that is in fact to be applauded. I would argue that the Commonwealth has been one of the loudest voices championing the cause of small states, and over the last 5 decades or so, we see the Commonwealth really taking, paying tremendous attention to the vulnerabilities of small island developing states. And most of the Commonwealth Caribbean are in fact, or constitute small island developing states. And that has therefore afforded member states the opportunity to develop and strengthen, the Commonwealth that is, has afforded many of us the opportunity to develop and strengthen bilateral relations with non-traditional trading partners as well. But equally, I would argue, there has been as I indicated, some very sharp friction between the British and the Caribbean, which has sometimes strained the Commonwealth itself, challenging the very unity of the institution. So what I'm arguing is that in relation to the values, we need to ask ourselves a question. Is the Commonwealth really doing or walking the talk? As I said before, the Commonwealth Charter, which is now, as indicated a while ago, almost 10 years old, speaks quite eloquently to issues related to human rights, transparency, fighting corruption, democracy, and gender equality, and others, which constitute the core of the principles of the Commonwealth. But I began by saying that there is a lack of distinction made between the monarchy, the UK or Britain, and the Commonwealth, which, as I said before, is viewed by many as indivisible. It is that lack of distinction, given the lead role or a leading role played by Britain in the association, in the association, we put it that way, combined with the continuing political presence of the British in the Caribbean in the form of overseas territories, some of which are very active members and associate members of regional and sub-regional organizations, that will further strain relations, at least from the Caribbean perspective. One of the core values of the institution, as articulated in its charter, is democracy. It would not hurt, I think, to read the charter, which affirms the inalienable right of Commonwealth citizens to participate in democratic processes, in particular through free and fair elections, in shaping the societies in which they live. And of course, there are others. There is in fact a very big disconnect, I think, between what the Commonwealth states in relation to issues of democracy and what it does with respect to its membership and their behaviors relative to promoting, and strengthening democracy in the region. We cannot, in fact, separate our actions as member states, and I'm speaking generally, we cannot separate our actions globally from the values that we promote as members of this institution or organization. So even as the Commonwealth Charter speaks to the strengthening of democracy, Britain has not been reluctant to impose its will unilaterally upon its overseas territories in the Caribbean. Even the links in the English-speaking Caribbean at a time when relations with the UK are not necessarily at the strongest, the latest pronouncements of the British governor of the British Virgin Islands cannot but further damage an already strained relationship. We must not forget that the threat, not veiled but opened by the UK to introduce direct rule in the BVI, and the manner in which it has, it has resonated across the Caribbean, is yet another cause of concern, given the expressions of the will of the people and so forth. This seems to be inconsistent with the values expressed in the Charter of the Commonwealth, and is coming some 16 years after the British government suspended major parts of the 2006 Turks and Caicos Island Constitution and the enactment of a new constitution in 2011. Between 2006 and the new constitution in 2011, we saw direct rule by the governor being introduced in Turks and Caicos, subject to the directions from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and the suspension too of ministerial government and proceedings of the House of Assembly. And so for us, this is yet another extreme example of the UK taking full control of one of the boards, which is, I'm talking about, of course, the situation in the BVI, which is again likely with the British Virgin Islands. Now, we know that the OECS and certainly CARICOM had been very critical in 2006 of the British action. Once again, we see criticisms leveled at the British. And as I indicated, it's very difficult for people in the Caribbean to disengage or disconnect Britain from the Commonwealth. And for that reason, there is the questioning of the relevancy of the continuing relevancy of the Commonwealth to the Caribbean. We have also witnessed, outside of the British overseas territories and what I referred to a while ago, we have also witnessed assaults on democratic freedoms, violations of electoral integrity, political leaders in the Caribbean behaving sometimes with impunity, as we're experiencing right now, for instance, in St. Kitts Nevis, and violations of the very constitutions which they have sworn to uphold. Clearly, as an association of nation states with a shared history and abiding history, largely shared history and abiding interest, the Commonwealth must be concerned with political developments that threaten the very foundations of constitutional democracy. And that is, of course, one of the values of the Commonwealth. So I speak, for instance, of the autocratic and minimally very anti-democratic actions, also the governments in frustrating the will of the people, in either proroguing our parliaments when circumstances are in fact unfavorable, or, as St. Kitts Nevis has done as recently as May of 2022, dissolve the parliament to frustrate the right of the opposition to debate a no-confidence motion in the government on the political circumstances suggestive of a defeat of that government. This is all the more disconcerting given that refusal to debate a motion of no confidence led already to a political impasse in St. Kitts and Nevis in 2013, which was not resolved until literally the eve of the next election. We've also seen in that country, in September 2019, the passing of a no confidence act, which requires that a no confidence motion in the government be brought before the National Assembly, and the question should be determined by a resolution at the National Assembly within a period not exceeding 21 days. But what we have seen in St. Kitts Nevis in the last 3 weeks is a clear violation of what they themselves, this very government, had in fact pledged to uphold, and for which they had been very critical of the previous administration. What is even more constitutionally and politically alarming is the failure to simultaneously advise of a date for an election, given the fact that, in fact, the parliament has been dissolved. Thus, for all intents and purposes, what we are seeing is that the very principle of responsible government, on which our states are constitutionally founded, is being purposefully violated by the government of St. Kitts Nevis. I believe this is, for instance, is a clear breach of the Charter, and CMAC ought to engage. I'm not sure if they have. If they have, they're not doing a very good public relations job of it, ought to engage in some kind of intervention. On this, there has been, to my mind, very little condemnation from the Commonwealth. And I would not going to say any more in relation to those issues. I want to applaud, of course, the Commonwealth for the work which the Commonwealth has done in relation to issues relative to election strengthening and the integrity of elections in the Caribbean. And so it is important that we focus or say a little bit about the Commonwealth's work on elections through the Commonwealth Observer Groups, which regularly monitors elections across the Caribbean, and for which the Caribbean has benefited tremendously. Now, given my interest in democratic governance, this for me is clearly one of the most critical roles that the Commonwealth has played and must continue to play to enhance electoral governance across the Commonwealth, and certainly the Caribbean, where there is still a great need for institutional strengthening on election machinery. The Commonwealth has done so for almost every single Caribbean country, save for Barbados, and of course the limitations imposed given the global health pandemic in the last 2 years. I think it is very important to note the role played by the Commonwealth in diffusing political tension, not only in the Caribbean, for instance, in Guyana, but certainly across the African continent. We know, for instance, the role it played in Ghana. We know, as I indicated a while, and elsewhere, we know, as I indicated a while ago, the very important role that it played in election monitoring, and in trying, as I indicated a while ago, diffusing the political tension, which really threatened Guyana in 2020. So we can take note of the protracted declaration of results and the diplomatic interventions by the Secretary General in addition to the role of its CHOGM in 2020 in preventing what may well have been a stolen election. But I sometimes think that the Commonwealth may be too narrowly focused on elections per se, and insufficient attention is being directed at the operations of Parliament, given what I said before, and the machinations of political leaders between elections. The Charter, which contains rights and obligations, now affords the institution an instrument to use to seek through diplomatic intervention some compliance with the basic obligations that heads of governments have committed to. I know I'm treading on some really sensitive grounds for many in the Caribbean, especially as it deals with issues not so much with social rights, but sexual rights, which are highly sensitive matters, and in many parts of this Commonwealth where we are supposed to experience these shared values. On the latter, there is clearly no consensus, and regional governments, even in the face of the increasingly vocal group in many jurisdictions, will have a difficult time in enforcing some of those rights that we see articulated in the Charter. Commonwealth has done a very impressive job in relation to training of women parliamentarians in pursuit, of course, of the value of achieving gender equality. So that what we are seeing in relation to the work the Commonwealth has been doing on gender and gender training for women, including gender-sensitive budgeting, is that we are hopeful that this would make a critical impact on women in relation to the ability to enter critical races, as well as make a difference in relation to their participation in the Parliament. So what I'm saying, on balance, where does that leave the association in relation to just the few items that I have decided that I needed to focus on, given, of course, my interests? It is not my intention to sow seeds of despair anywhere, but rather to focus on how to keep the embers burning fiercely in the best interest of all member states and citizens. If we are to accept that there exists a perception problem, which I think there clearly is in relation to the Caribbean, a perception that equates the Commonwealth with the desire of Britain to maintain global relevancy, in other words, a deliberate construct to enhance or maintain British global positioning, then the obvious direction for the Commonwealth is to reshape the institution in a way that has even more tangible benefits for all members. And while I have stressed the well-stated claims to the democratic, accountable, and equality values of the institution, this too cannot be seen in a vacuum. We are cognizant of what the post-health pandemic environment looks like, and the possibility that many of the democratic erosions experienced may be difficult to roll back. So the Commonwealth clearly has to be very vigilant. But equally too, I'm saying, outside of what I have stressed, we must be concerned with the economic difficulties that many states have always and will continue to experience, which have been made all the more difficult with the global pandemic, climate change, and the implications arising thereof, especially for the small island states. not to ignore the global economic consequences of the war in the Ukraine and the consequences for so many economies. So whatever decisions are taken by the heads of governments must be reflected in forms of collaboration and engagement, which are meaningful to all members of the group, outcomes which among other things must balance mutual respect, economic opportunity with aid and trade, and a continued focus on, of course, issues of democratic governance. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Cynthia. While you're there, are there any questions of clarification or things that people wanted cleared up before we move on to the next speaker? If there aren't, I mean, I think that was fantastic. Thanks very much, Cynthia. You know, you've highlighted the need for mechanisms that help to internalise, in a sense, domesticate the global values in national instruments. And without that, you've highlighted the vacuum that causes, because it means that the Commonwealth remains remote because people can't make the connection between the global aspiration or statement or roadmap that's been set out and what they see on a day-to-day basis. Where there's nothing to fill that, people fill that space with their own assumptions and preconceptions of what the Commonwealth is. And then they find the dysfunction compounded when they see the mismatch between the actions, for example, of the British government in relation to the overseas territories, which I think was highlighted one of the specificities of that region. But apart from that, you could actually argue that some of those points that Cynthia was making are applicable across the association. So I think that you've highlighted some really interesting points there, Cynthia, and ending with that urging to look beyond, to acknowledge the things that the Commonwealth does well, but to need to look beyond, for example, election monitoring, and engage with the depth of democracy and the depth of governance processes, I think was something that resonated with earlier comments. With that, we're going to move on to the next speaker. William, I think you're up, as they say. So William's the executive board member for the Commonwealth Journalists Association, is an international director of the Centre for Media Freedom at the University of Sheffield. He's a former long-serving BBC foreign correspondent, and he's contributed to policy innovations on media freedom through UNESCO, the Council of Europe, and other international organisations. He helped coordinate the working group of 6 Commonwealth professional associations which in 2018 published a landmark set of draft Commonwealth principles on media and good governance, prompting the Commonwealth's active engagement with the topical need to protect the role of independent media in government accountability. William, it's yours.
Thank you very much indeed, Vijay. The weight of the experience on the Commonwealth in the room is tangible. I feel naked and ignorant by comparison. But I just want to start by welcoming thanking everybody, all the organisers of this excellent event, and saying how glad I am that the Institute of Commonwealth Studies in particular has escaped its near-death experience of the recent past, thanks to the review under Sir Malcolm Rifkind and so on. I want to be a bit provocative. I agree with a lot of what Cynthia has just said, and this issue of the absence of the Commonwealth in sensitive areas, sensitive to member states, I believe is the key both to our discussion today and to the loss of credibility and reputation of the Commonwealth. And I want to suggest some things that need to be done about that. I would say that the Commonwealth, in short, is being killed by courtesy and deference in excess. I would ask the question, why is the Commonwealth absent from one of the hottest political discussions, most important things for functioning democracy in the 21st century, which is the protection of freedom of expression and media freedom in an active sense. When you go to international forums, you see the Francophonie, you see the African Union, you see all the other regional organizations. Commonwealth is not seen speaking out. It does on small states and many other things, and we heard particularly about the election monitoring, which I applaud. And for myself, I've been particularly impressed by the vigor of the civil society organizations, particularly the Human Rights Initiative, dealing with things like modern slavery, the judges and magistrates and their work on the integrity of courts and so on. But the institutional Commonwealth is not just missing a trick, it's absent without leave. So I'm talking about freedom of expression and particularly the Charter. Just to remind you that the Charter, Article 5, speaks about the free flow of information and strengthening the democratic processes for the sake of accountability. It adds very importantly that we, the people of the Commonwealth and the states, are committed to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other relevant human rights covenants and international instruments. These principles, which Vijay mentioned in 2018, kicked off a process of dragging, so to speak, the Commonwealth into this arena. And many of the people here, including those in the Secretariat, know what a tricky path it has been. Probably for them, but in particular for us. Blowing hot and cold, being told it's an open door, and then being put in the freezer. We're in a period of freezer at the moment, but a very important moment because the Commonwealth has been moving on the text of principles, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that as far as I can later. I'm going to suggest 3 points for your consideration. First, give you some examples of how the suppression by Commonwealth governments of media independence in particular cases does and has deprived ordinary people of the rights and values which the Commonwealth holds dear. Secondly, to have a look at the missed opportunities, as I see it, to establish effective ways to counter the misuse of power in this arena by overmighty states. And thirdly, I want to make some constructive suggestions about how the Commonwealth might make use of what I'm going to call the existing international rescue services for international intergovernmental organizations and nation states, and that they should consider their own mechanism or some way of playing an active part in keeping member states on the straight and narrow. The thing about freedom of expression, no special pleading here, is that according to the International Covenant, that's the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is the Bible or the holy book of this arena, freedom of expression and opinion, as well as a free, uncensored and unhindered media, are both necessary to achieve not just accountability of institutions, but they form a basis for the full enjoyment of a wide range of other fundamental human rights, including the right to freedom of assembly and association and the exercise of the right to vote. Okay, that gives the media a special place. What about the media's own responsibility? The Commonwealth has developed its own language on this, which is in the Charter, speaks about a free and responsible media. That's elaborated in the Latimer House principles a little bit more, but the idea is still there. It's not a phrase used by international law texts at all, which speak about the protection of a free, independent and plural media. Those are the essential things. However, the Commonwealth, in my firm belief, is wedded to a key idea, which is self-regulation of the press. That was a cardinal element of an earlier best practices book published by the Commonwealth Secretariat in I think 2012. But this issue of media capture by political forces and the manipulation of the media and abuse of the media, indeed, also by journalists, of course, is now absolutely at the heart of the political debate as well. So it's used for aggressive propaganda wars. We've seen in Russia, also in Rwanda once upon a time. However, the key text that I would refer you to is last year's Windhoek Declaration 30 years later. This is the African journalists who first came up with this formula after the end of apartheid, of the need for free, independent and plural media. This declaration, under the UNESCO's aegis last year, said, by an independent press, we mean a press independent from governments, political and economic control, or from control of material and infrastructure essential for the production of news and news publications. So that is the heart of the matter. So it's a defining issue for the 21st century. The war on truth, the abuse of fake news laws, the criminalization of the work of journalists, the slide towards authoritarianism, they're all connected. There are, in the latest Reporters Without Borders index, Press Freedom Index, in the bottom 50, in the tier of the bottom 50 scoring states, there are 10 Commonwealth ones. So I'll give you just a few topical examples of how individual Commonwealth states have been interfering with media freedom and the safety of journalists, and the impact it has on ordinary people. October 2017, you may remember Daphne Caruana Galizia in Malta, Commonwealth state, was killed in a mafia-style remote-controlled car bomb. She was so popular that her readership was larger than all the mainstream media in the island put together, because she exposed corruption, misuse of power by those in high office. After nearly 5 years, the people responsible, the mastermind and most of those involved who've been identified, have not been brought to justice. That is impunity. The climate of impunity has very pernicious effects, has a chilling effect on the whole society, as is very clear from Daphne's life. The Commonwealth's voice, unfortunately, has not been heard in this. There's an absolute chorus, a focus of attention by European bodies, the UN, and so on. Commonwealth, I have not heard. If it has spoken out, I would like to know about it. Secondly, in June last year, the Editors Guild of India issued a protest saying that the police had failed to protect the life of Sulabh Srivastava in Uttar Pradesh, who had been threatened, and he'd asked for police protection after being hounded by a mafia gang, a liquor mafia gang. The statement accused the police of covering up the truth, claiming it was a motorcycle accident, and they also spoke about the police in that state unjustifiably and often using laws such as sedition to arrest and charge journalists to silence them. This is the kind of story you hear from many, many places. The alleged collusion of those in law enforcement or in power with criminal gangs. Australia, there was an outcry in 2019 after the police raided the ABC Australia TV newsroom, claiming it was breaching national security laws after it came in possession of evidence alleging abuses by the Australian armed forces in Afghanistan. After that, the newspapers in Australia blacked out their pages in protest and claimed that this was covering up an abuse. Their appeal was rejected in court. A very damaging precedent for press freedom within the Commonwealth and the public's right to know. So-called fake news laws. These are quite prevalent in quite a number of countries, but according to Reporters Without Borders, for example, if you look at their recent publications, Singapore and Bangladesh both have laws which are repressive by their standards, so that it gives, in the Singapore case, it gives arbitrary powers to governments instead of independent regulators for policing speech and taking stuff down and indeed criminalizing it. And in Bangladesh, the Digital Security Act allows governments to harass those who annoy the authorities. 400 people have been prosecuted since 2018. Last month, Zafar Abbas, the editor of Dawn, spoke to an international Institute of Commonwealth Studies event and spoke about the media regulation which has been introduced in Pakistan, causing by the government for its own purposes, resulting in widespread self-censorship. He said after 20 years of very large number, hundreds, or close to 100 journalists have been killed in Pakistan, today the authorities are killing journalism. And so these are several examples, and I don't do them to single out a particular country, not at all. It is, though, shocking that this kind of scale of well-documented suppression happens within an organisation with these things on its flagpole. One more example, which is more positive in its way. Last year, also the Nigerian government suddenly and completely suspended Twitter following the social media site's dispute with the Nigerian president about a tweet which it said violated its policy against abusive behaviour. As a result, of course, millions were deprived of an important information source and communication source. This time, however, the Secretary-General, Patricia Scotland, did reply to a plea from an NGO in Nigeria, the Socio-Economic Rights and Accountability Project, SERAP. And importantly, she said that the Commonwealth is closely monitoring developments in Nigeria because of the allegations of repressions of right to freedom of expression, etc. And she also invoked the Commonwealth Charter and its commitment to uphold international law. That, I think, is important for this conversation because it's a precedent to me. So, second major area, how has the Commonwealth failed to meet the challenge of the 21st century to develop its own ways of reining in the misuse of power by states? Well, it's worth recording on the positive side the finer moments. You know, the Commonwealth's claimed role in the fight against apartheid many years ago. But the challenge came about 10 years ago, which you've been discussing earlier today, I think, with the Eminent Persons Group, I think of 2011, proposing a commissioner for democracy, rule of law, and human rights. And the idea was that this figure would give well-researched information to the Secretary-General, and there would be an oversight function. This, to me, is the key to making real sense of the Commonwealth's involvement in this area. Secondly, at the same time, there was this discussion about expanding the mandate for the Commonwealth Ministerial Action Group to include serious and persistent breaches of democratic standards, including egregious violations of human rights, undermining of the judiciary, lack of space for the opposition, and systematic constraints on civil society and the media. My way of putting this would be that the guard dog that was created has not barked, at least not loudly. Not to be unkind, but it seems to me that the lack of a sense of legitimacy, independence and authority in the CMAG is at the heart of that relatively quiet performance. So the balance between the states, which have a monopoly of power in their own borders, and civil society, which should be the hallmark of a democratic institution, is out of balance. I do believe, though, that the Commonwealth can learn through innovative, original thinking at a time like this from other intergovernmental organisations. In particular, I've done some work for the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which also has shared values. It grew out of the Helsinki Accords of 1975 and the idea of a Europe whole and free and democratic with free flow of information at the heart. Now, 25 years ago, in 1997, perhaps a golden age, the 50-plus participating states were bold enough then to create an independent body to oversee them. It's called the Office of the Representative on Freedom of the Media, and that role is to have an early warning function, to have a warning function, to have a function helping reform and improve laws, but above all, it's a whistleblower. They have power to go and knock on doors. They visit. Moscow is still in. Russia is still in the OSCE. It's been thrown out of the Council of Europe. That's the kind of thing that an organisation based on consensus, not on treaty, can do if the member states. So we need some political leadership on that. It seems to me. Now, the heart of the matter today, I raised the mention of the media freedom principles, which the 6 organisations, I see John Davis from the Parliamentary Association is here, also Sue Onslow from the Institute, and the others, the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association and the Commonwealth Legal Educators Association and the Institute of the Human Rights Initiative. All this is truly, it's sort of miraculous, really. I think since the Latimer House process, which came to a head in 2003, we've never seen anything like it. So it is absolutely extraordinary, particularly lasting over a period of 4 years. 4 years of quite hard work. Now, last year, thanks to the support of friendly governments and our partners among the other Commonwealth professional associations, an official process was begun. There was a mandate given to the Secretariat by the states represented in a law officials meeting to examine the substantive issues that lay behind the original 2018 publication and to make recommendations. It was pretty much as loose as that. Now, we're enjoined to respect confidentiality because we had some say or some part in the following conversations. So in the Commonwealth method, I can't go into great detail on this. However, the issue is of monumental importance, and it's important that people interested in the Commonwealth know that this has been put in the fridge for a time because a meeting that was scheduled before CHOGM in maybe March of this year, through lack of time or resources or for whatever reason, has been delayed until the last quarter of the year, which means that in the cycle of Commonwealth decision-making, there is a bit of a hiatus. But that gap can be used productively. So at this time, there was a self-selecting group of Commonwealth states which joined this review process. Online conference took place during basically the last 4 months of last year up to the end of November. And I'm happy to say that there was a text came out of it at the end. Now, we get to the tricky bit against the background of what I've just said about the responsibility of states and intergovernmental organisations dealing with the misuse of power by state authorities, so that the Commonwealth organisations, the non-government organisations, have made known some reservations about the wording of the text, and we think it's really important that this process does not end with the adoption of a text which then closes the book on it. We think this should be the start of a productive dialogue, which I think is in keeping with the spirit of today's meeting. So, if you look at the Commonwealth's record, according to UNESCO, in the most vital area, which is the rule of law and access to justice related to the media, you find that the Commonwealth's record on impunity, that's to say the failure to bring justice in cases of killings in particular of journalists, is at a monumental rate of 96%. So only 4% of all the killings result in those responsible being brought to justice. I think that that's not a tolerable situation for an organisation like the Commonwealth, and I hope that it will lead to reforms. So, here are some forward-looking proposals. These have been elaborated and thought through by the Commonwealth Journalists Association in discussion also with our partners. They're not a formal thing, but I see myself, and from my own background, great opportunities now in this period, in fact during this year, for the Commonwealth to make use of what I've called these international rescue services, including UNESCO, the lead UN agency on freedom of expression, and the UK-inspired high-level panel on media freedom. The fact that the Secretary-General has herself invoked the Charter in at least one area of this is a hopeful sign, even though I believe that the Secretariat should rethink its press policy so that it does not remain silent when outrages take place in future. But there are precedents. The Latimer House guidelines were made into the Latimer House principles in 2003, although I've noticed that they have not been widely cited today. These are meant to be the fundamental political values of the Commonwealth. I wonder why they haven't cropped up. I think one reason is that they never achieved the status of a red channel mechanism. They've been a green channel mechanism with excellent organisations, Commonwealth lawyers, magistrates and judges, and the Legal Education Association involved with monitoring, with putting out important statements of interference with the judiciary and related things to do with the separation of powers, but the Commonwealth institutionally has stood back. So I would remind the Secretariat and everybody interested that the Commonwealth is an IGO which is part of the world conversation. UNESCO has set up what it calls a light touch task force to coax in organisations like the Commonwealth into a discussion, and particularly oriented towards the fact that this year, at the end of this year, November, we'll see the 10th anniversary of the setting up of the UN Action Plan on the safety of journalists and the issue of impunity. So like the Media Freedom Coalition, this is linking the idea of freedom of expression and the media's work with the fundamental rule of law questions. Now, there was an event where I and Anne Gallagher actually both spoke in February this year, and I was frankly disappointed, to put it mildly, that the Commonwealth was not represented, or at least I understand that it was not represented. If I'm wrong, I'd really like to know. But that kind of thing shouldn't happen in an organisation which puts its values on the masthead. So, then one more. The Commonwealth sees itself as a champion of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Quite right. Well, one of the most important of those is number 16, which deals with accountable institutions, access to justice, and also access to information, media matters. And there is one, the UN is particularly focused on one of the targets, which asks all member states of the UN to monitor, to do their own close monitoring of attacks on journalists, human rights defenders, trade unionists. The reason is because of their crucial role in keeping functioning democracy going, and the risk of the chilling effect when journalists are silenced and then there's impunity. So why doesn't the Commonwealth Secretariat team up with these organisations? Maybe they might get some funding as well. There's a big media freedom fund now, defence fund, which is set up through the agency of Canada and the UK in the first place. And maybe use some of its expertise to advise these governments, to help them with these things, and also with replying to the inquiries from UNESCO after the killing of journalists for information about the judicial follow-up. And if you look at the record of the UNESCO Director General's report, the record of Commonwealth countries in this area is abominable. Many of them fail to reply completely. And the record of impunity, as we've just discussed, is very high. So, There is also room here for a much bigger conversation. And I mean, I've been speaking with the high-level panel of legal experts, which is also related to the Media Freedom Coalition. They are more than willing to offer their advice and services. UNESCO, I've already mentioned. The Commonwealth is actually looking at an open door here. And it seems to me that if the Commonwealth were to continue acting as a leaders' club, where it's not possible to say boo to member states for fear of giving offence, its reputation will sink. It has to face up to this and be part of that conversation. That's my message. Thank you.
Thank you very much, William. Thanks for that comprehensive review of the state of play when it comes to media freedom in particular. You've given us a good clue as to the ways in which Commonwealth's narrative on media freedom has echoes in other statutes, other policy statements, other institutions. But you've highlighted the specific ways in which the Commonwealth is falling short in following up in the ways that those other institutions might. You've also highlighted some examples, very helpful, given the tone of the day's conversation on forward-looking, on ways in which we could look to perhaps, you mentioned the OSCE, you mentioned UNESCO, and the mechanisms that they've adopted for helping to make the guard dog bark, did you say? And I think those were really helpful as well. Thank you very much, William. Are there any questions for William before we take our third speaker? Mark.
Yes, just one question. William, thank you for that absolute excellent exposition. It did strike me because when I first got involved in this, I was executive director of the Commonwealth Press Union for 5 years. But it was very much supported by the British media. But they seem to have fallen away from that. And there's a talk demonstrates this. There's a CGJA, of course, and the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative. But there's no central focus on media freedom, and perhaps whether that should come from the Commonwealth Secretariat or whether it should come from somewhere else, some rebuilding perhaps needs to be done. Just a supplementary to that, in the days of the Commonwealth Press Union, I got £500,000 of funds from the World Bank for training journalists and seminars on press freedom, and I wonder if that was in the days when Mark Malloch-Brown was the Vice President of the World Bank, and has that died away in the World Bank, or does it still exist?
Some very quick responses to that, William, if you,
do I need this, or
this one there?
Okay, I'll be very quick. Well, the Commonwealth Press Union Media Trust was one of many organisations that we consulted when we did our work in 2018. Very valuable to have their input. I think the media are in this country face, like in every country, the government is very jealous of its decision-making power in the area of media. But inside the UK, this is, as I said, an extremely hot topic. Laws on protest, on national security, on online harms, all these areas are absolutely the nub of functioning democracy, as I said. But it's quite difficult. I mean, even the launch of the Media Freedom Coalition in 2019, Jeremy Hunt is the inspirer. The UK press, I think maybe they were not invited in the terms they like. They can also be quite sniffy. I think they like to do it on their own terms. It's their topic. And dealing with governments can also be a bit of a double-edged sword. So I agree with you. They need to be much more aware. I think this initiative is one that they should pay attention to. I'll be watching the Kigali summit very closely to see what comes out there. Thank you.
Colleagues, so I'm going to move us on to our third speaker for this session. That's Sneh Aurora. Sneh's joining us online. Sneh's the head of the CHRI, the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative's London office, and in that capacity oversees all its work, including strategy, development, planning, international advocacy. Sneh also works as a human rights consultant with a particular focus on strategy and programme development, programme management and evaluation, capacity building and facilitating organisational processes. Sneh was formerly a member of the management team of Amnesty International, and she led its global human rights education programme, developing strategy, building capacity and providing technical expertise to over 50 Amnesty national offices. Sneh has participated in international regional standard setting and policy development, including on the right to education and the rights of women. Sneh, are you online? Yay. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me start by wishing everyone a good afternoon and by thanking Vijay for that introduction, and also the organizations for holding this event and for inviting me to participate. I'm sorry I could not be there with you all today to debate these very important issues in person, but I'm pleased to hear and contribute to the discussion. On the topic of this seminar, is the Commonwealth working? The types of questions that we're asking may be tough, but they are critical to ensure that the Commonwealth remains relevant and true to its principles. So when I was asked to contribute to this session on Commonwealth values, I had to pause, for it is difficult for me as a human rights practitioner to fully grasp how universal values such as equality, human dignity, peace, freedom could be labeled as their own by particular groups, such as the Commonwealth or any particular nation. The more I thought about it, however, the more I see that universal or widely accepted values which express an optimistic vision of humanity are in fact useful for specific groups that share specific characteristics. And of course, this includes the Commonwealth, which is, as we all know, a unique association of nations and indeed of people that have a shared history, legal frameworks, and have a common language. So today, in my exposition, I will share some thoughts on the importance of human rights in the articulation and implementation of Commonwealth values. My short talk covers 3 points. First, I'll start with a bit of context. I will bring it back to the basics and offer a brief history on how human rights has become critical to Commonwealth values to remind us all and also inform those that may not be so familiar. Second, I'll look at how recent global events has led to the deterioration of and hampered the realization of human rights. And alas, we have seen the lack of action of the Commonwealth to address these challenges. And finally, as others have done, I will conclude with a few recommendations on how the Commonwealth can and should move forward. So to the first point on the origins of human rights as a value in the Commonwealth. Today, human rights are deeply embedded in the Commonwealth's shared values. You only have to look at the Commonwealth Charter, which is founded on 16 core beliefs, which places human rights squarely in the center. Democracy, human rights, international peace and security, tolerance, freedom of expression, rule of law, good governance, access to health, education, food, gender equality, as well as inclusion and participation are all well enshrined in the Charter. The Charter reinforces the importance of young people in the Commonwealth, recognizes the particular needs of the small states, as well as developing states. And it also recognizes the important role of civil society. It was not always the case that human rights were integrated into the fabric of the Commonwealth. In the past, the focus was on the traditional non-interference principle, the unwritten tenet of the Commonwealth Association that inhibited its member states to criticize or interfere in another Commonwealth state's domestic affairs. As well, there is the Commonwealth norm to maintain consensus and avoid tough questions, which has also divided states on critical issues of human rights. However, with the rise of and the significance of the UN human rights frameworks and mechanisms, and with human rights situations seriously deteriorating in the 1970s in particular, this challenged this non-intervention principle, and the Commonwealth could no longer ignore the state of the world. And in 1977, as we all know, the Commonwealth affirmed these values by proactively denouncing serious violations of human rights within its jurisdiction. Most of us will recall that at the London Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, or CHOGM, in 1977, the Commonwealth, under the leadership of Secretary General Ramphal, condemned in its communique, and I quote, the systemic disregard of the sanctity of human life and massive violations of basic human rights in Uganda. And the Commonwealth has also taken action against other non-democratic governments. In 1987, following a coup d'etat in Fiji that was contrary to Commonwealth principles, the Commonwealth suspended Fiji as a member. And similarly, the Commonwealth suspended Nigeria in 1995 when a military government that threatened human rights and democracy was in charge. Both countries were subsequently readmitted to the Commonwealth. In 1981, at the Melbourne Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, the heads of government agreed to set up a Commonwealth Human Rights Unit at the Commonwealth Secretariat. And the Human Rights Unit was in fact created in 1985 with the mandate to promote understanding and respect for human rights in line with both Commonwealth principles and international human rights standards. And in a sense, the creation of the Human Rights Unit was also a product of the Commonwealth's uncomfortable experience with Uganda. And over time, as human rights became an increasing focus for the Commonwealth and under strong leadership, the mandate of the Human Rights Unit to promote the understanding of and respect for human rights expanded to include protection. The unit's mandate evolved to supporting Commonwealth countries' efforts to promote, protect, and respect internationally recognized human rights principles, standards, and practices. However, we all know that more can be done to strengthen and resource this mandate at the Commonwealth Secretariat. Then in the lead up to the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in 1991 in Harare, civil society was pressing the Commonwealth to advance the human rights agenda. At this time, the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative, CHRI, actively and persistently advocated for an enhanced human rights function for the Commonwealth. At the CHOGM, or the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in 1991, the Commonwealth adopted the Harare Declaration, which we all know affirmed that human rights are among the fundamental political values of the Commonwealth. It also includes a program of action for states that places priority on human rights and on strengthening democracy. It's also important to highlight here that Commonwealth states must abide by the Harare Principles as a condition of membership. Human rights has been identified now as one of the major issues for future Commonwealth cooperation. Another landmark framework that William referred to and others is the Commonwealth Latimer House Principles that was adopted at the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in 2003. And this framework stresses the role of the three branches of government, as we all know, in the promotion and protection of fundamental human rights and good governance based on the highest standards of honesty, probity, and accountability. And finally, I mentioned another framework that was mentioned also by William, the Commonwealth Principles on Commonwealth Principles on freedom of expression and the role of the media in good governance, which was adopted in 2018 by the Commonwealth Journalists Association, working closely with us, the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative, and 4 other Commonwealth organizations. And as heard by William just now, the framework was the basis for the development by Commonwealth states of media principles, which will now go to the law ministers meeting this fall, and then in CHOGM in 2024 for adoption. So now I'd like to move to the second part of my exposition. For many of the 2.5 billion people within the Commonwealth, life continues to be challenging. First, the climate crisis is a continuing global threat that disproportionately impacts some of the small island developing states, as we've heard from Cynthia, and also other vulnerable communities within Commonwealth countries. Armed conflict, most recently the war in Ukraine, but of course there are other conflicts. And the increase of anti-democratic politics are threatening international peace, security, democracy, and the human rights of people. And also the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed and exacerbated structural inequalities globally and nationally, as is demonstrated by unequal access to vaccines that was mentioned earlier, and the disproportionate impacts of the pandemic on the most vulnerable groups, such as children, the elderly, Indigenous communities, women, persons with disabilities, and persons in situations of poverty. Media freedoms are under decline and threatened within the Commonwealth, and threats to media freedoms further erode democratic values and also diminishes state accountability. And of course, enduring issues of discrimination, inequality, poor governance, the rights of migrants are also at threat. And modern slavery is still an ongoing issue in the Commonwealth. Of the 40.3 million people living in modern slavery globally, approximately 40% reside in the Commonwealth. And this is one person in 150. These violations are still happening in the Commonwealth right now as we speak, and this has to end. So in these challenging times, we come to the question, what needs to be done? What can and should the Commonwealth do? We must go beyond the reiteration of political commitments. We have plenty of documents, plenty of frameworks. The CHOGM communique is a worthy document. But what happens after CHOGM, the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting? What happens after it? Now it is time to act to make these commitments and promises operative. States need to respect their commitments to human rights-based values. They must reflect and integrate them in their policies, such as is required by the Latimer House principles. The challenge now is to operationalize human rights through cooperation and overcoming obstacles such as budgetary restraint or political will. There are, of course, some bright lights on the horizon. It is promising to see the increase in the level and depth of engagement of the Commonwealth Foundation under the stewardship of Anne Gallagher, who you heard from earlier today, ensuring the involvement of Commonwealth citizens from across all jurisdictions, ensuring that individuals, groups, and civil society, no matter who or where they are from, have a voice at the table and are able to speak their truth, to inform and to work alongside states to create societies that are democratic, that are peaceful, just, and equal. Learning from these diverse perspectives, which are based on a shared experience that all bring to the table, is one key benefit of this Commonwealth and allows us to shake the brutal history of colonialism. Richard Bourne, who I believe is in the audience there, is one of the founders of the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative and a longtime Commonwealth scholar. He once said that the Commonwealth seems to come alive in crisis. Well, we are facing a crisis now, and where is the Commonwealth? The Commonwealth must step up as an organization. It must demonstrate its commitment to these basic values rooted in human rights. Otherwise, the very credibility of the Commonwealth as a values-based entity is at risk. This includes pushing for the adoption of the media principles that William spoke about at the next CHOGM after their review and approval by law ministers this fall. This is something that I mentioned that CHRI has contributed to and has pushed over the years with other Commonwealth organizations. This also means strengthening Commonwealth institutions to uphold the Commonwealth's human rights-based values, the setting up of a body or group to monitor adherence to human rights principles of members and potential members of the Commonwealth. We have heard from others the need to strengthen the Commonwealth Ministerial Action Group, CMAG. They must function independently and have the authority to ensure that the principles of the Commonwealth Charter are upheld. And CMAG must also be able to fulfill the expanded brief that it was proposed and given in 2012 to respond to threats to civil society and the media and other rights which are under severe threat. Another intergovernmental structure we must strengthen, as we've heard today, is the Commonwealth Secretariat, with strong leadership and resourced departments and programs to enhance its ability to promote and protect human rights. Anne mentioned earlier a need for more connections with the people of the Commonwealth, and this includes young people, vulnerable groups, those that are marginalized. I believe we need to hear more of their voices. Let's take a critical look at who is speaking to the Commonwealth, who is speaking to the Commonwealth at the upcoming Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Kigali, in the forums and in the official meetings. We can reach the people of the Commonwealth through the networks and outreach of Commonwealth organizations and associations. We must strengthen partnerships. Close cooperation and coordination between the Commonwealth's three pillars, states, civil society, and the Commonwealth Secretariat are more necessary than ever before. We must also hold states to account for continuing human rights violations in their countries and not reward them with a secure place and or recognition through investment or hosting a major Commonwealth event within the Commonwealth family. This means taking a stand. It means speaking out and taking action to protect our core values. It means coming together and uniting under this canopy of this shared understanding and shared values, and having the courage to defend these Commonwealth principles and ideals. Though the road may be bumpy and there are many turns, if we consider it our collective task to keep to the track and help others find their way, I believe then the potential and growth of the Commonwealth may be realized. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sneh. Any questions specifically to Sneh on that presentation? Mark?
A very quick, sorry. A very quick question. There are a lot of areas you've highlighted where you feel the Commonwealth should take a more proactive stance. But the Commonwealth works by, it's not a treaty organisation, and it works by consensus. Is consensus the very brake on actually being able to achieve some of these things?
Now, I can see a number of other hands going up. I'd ask you just to consider whether these questions are specifically to Sneh or things that you'd like to ask in the round. If you want to ask them specifically to Sneh, please proceed and ask your question. John?
I think this qualifies, although others have raised it. So Sneh and others raised having strong institutions, a body or a group to report on people's adherence to human rights principles. What would be different, Sneh, but others have mentioned it too, about a Commonwealth body assessing that than, say, the multiplicity you already have through the Human Rights Council and the like? What would be different?
Okay. Very good. Last one.
I'm going to be controversial here, but I'm going to pick up, this is a question for Sneh, but I'm going to pick up on what Cynthia was saying, also what Elaine said this morning. Sneh, when you and I sit in that room with the Secretary General, the face-to-face meeting of accredited organisations or a Zoom call, the lack of people of colour is glaring. In fact, 2 years after Black Lives Matter, it's even more glaring. So my question to you, Sneh, is until accredited organisations live and breathe their values in terms of having people that represent them being not just, well, people of colour as well, you know, in its full diversity, we are never going to be able to answer the question that Joy asked all of us earlier today, which is who is the Commonwealth for? And that's my question to Sneh.
Okay. Sneh, do you want to come back on those specific points before I open it up to questions to all panellists?
I can respond to some of them. I'm cognizant of the fact that I'm speaking to so many scholars, researchers, practitioners who are much more knowledgeable about the history of the Commonwealth than I, and that my colleagues on this panel should also have an opportunity to share their views on these very, very critical questions as well. So I will be brief. On John's question about what is the difference between the Commonwealth and other mechanisms that are out there, in particular the United Nations, I think one of the main issues that I've seen with the United Nations human rights mechanisms is the fact that it is very political. I'm not saying that the Commonwealth is not, but it's very political, but it's also taken over by the larger states. And I think that the Commonwealth, I believe that the Commonwealth is an entity, it's an association that really does have the opportunity, the potential to support the small island developing states and other developing states to amplify their voice, their needs, their priorities in these very critical international spaces. That would be one thing that I would see the Commonwealth the institution of the Commonwealth very important. To Arif, the lack of people of color. Yes, it's an interesting one. I think that traditionally the Commonwealth as an institution is perceived to be and has been a certain type of entity. I think that it is very important, and we've spoken about this, others have spoken about this earlier, to engage others in this world, in this room. I heard that there was someone who said, well, what is the purpose of the Commonwealth? I don't believe that the Commonwealth is actually articulating its purpose, its relevancy to those that are outside of this closed circle. There are others who can take up this baton and see the potential and take up the cause of the Commonwealth, and also ensure that the Commonwealth values are maintained and enhanced. I think we have to do a lot more to reach out to these people, the young people in particular, those that are not in London, as Anne has said. I do believe that entirely, that if we are able to give space to those voices that are not typically or traditionally at the Commonwealth tables, then the Commonwealth will be lacking. So we need to ensure that this happens.
I'm going to offer the other two panellists an opportunity to comment on the questions that have been posed already. William.
Thank you very much. I'll try and be coherent to the point on this. The point about consensus is, of course, unavoidable, but that is the nature of the beast. But we're constantly being told, and the Secretariat underlines this all the time, member states must lead. So actually, the political leadership has to come from those states which really mean it. And here there is an obstacle, the colonial legacy, or at least the perception of the colonial legacy. But I think, we've got to be a bit more grown up now. We all know that that's not the case. We all know that these are universal rights. I mean, the Charter is copying the Universal Declaration and all the rest. And it works the same for everyone. And this is why I think the UN, the Human Rights Council, UNESCO, and related bodies have really shown the way in the most remarkable way. When the UN was launching its action plan on journalist safety, because they identified it, there was very open resistance from a number of Commonwealth, particularly from South Asian countries actually, and they tried to block it. What happened? It was kicked upstairs, or it was put up to the Secretary General level. So the Secretary General is now the boss of coordinating all this, because there was sufficient momentum. So you have to get the momentum. But we have tried from the outside, and during COVID it was perhaps that much difficult because of online. But that is absolutely essential, unless, as I say, the Commonwealth is going to turn its back on that and say that's not our business. That relates to the other question, which is what would the Commonwealth in particular bring to it? Well, these leaders do converse. The foreign ministers have things in common. They have meetings, they have agendas. If they don't do it, that gives a signal that this is not what we're about, defending those principles. So we have to see it. And I think the civil society organisations must raise their voice and say we expect it. I mean, maybe a little bit off beam saying this, but we did actually make an approach to try and get our agenda onto the CMAG once. We were easily scuppered by the manoeuvres of the due process and so on. It's much too easy. So we need the Board of Governors, we need the willing states and individual states which really mean it to step up. And this agenda and the ones that Sneh spoke about, I think, are central.
Cynthia, would you like to comment or respond in some way?
Yes, thank you. I suppose that I'm not as versed on the Commonwealth processes as some of my colleagues and some of the people in the room, but it seems clear to me that I just want to respond to one of the points raised by Sneh, and that is, of course, the role of the Commonwealth in facilitating small island states in having a conversation with a larger number of countries. And so that the Commonwealth, having the ability therefore to put their views on the agenda, provides, at the level of the Commonwealth, provides these small island states in the Caribbean the opportunity to have support, particularly at the level of the United Nations, where they are not so impactful. So I just wanted to support that particular intervention on the part of Sneh.
Thanks, Cynthia. One last round of questions. So I'll take the first three hands I see. I see Karen. Anyone else? No one else? Karen.
Thank you very much. As a few people have mentioned the Latimer House principles, I thought I should talk about that in particular. In the guidelines that led to the principles, of course, we had monitoring mechanisms as an idea to going forward, but unfortunately it never got through to the principles. Monitoring is a bad word in the Commonwealth, unfortunately. There are, however, other mechanisms that we can use, and I think those are the ones that we've been trying to implement through the Latimer House Working Group, which is the toolkit, the dialogue between the three branches of government, including media as well. We've had colloquia, we've had plans of action as a result of the Latimer House process. They haven't got very far as yet because of the maybe institutional reluctance to take them any further within the Commonwealth Secretariat. I know there have been attempts to try and push these forward, but I think those are the areas that we should be concentrating on. We have an added value that we can monitor, but with development, capacity build at the same time as deal with changes to the way people think within the Commonwealth. And I think that's the way forward for all of us, to try and change attitudes by helping capacity building. Unfortunately, as I can't remember who said this morning, the resources for the development side of things, I think it was Indrajit who said the resources for capacity building and development have reduced tremendously, and that's been very detrimental to the advancement of the Commonwealth fundamental values, and I think we should try and get that back as part of the programmes that we are working on within the Commonwealth Secretariat.
Colleagues, I'm looking at the clock. I'm going to have to draw this session to a close. Only remains for me to thank the speakers for an excellent session. You know, as Sneh was describing the history of the evolution of the statute, the instruments, the policy instruments that guide the institution, I must admit I couldn't help thinking that perhaps the Commonwealth Charter hadn't actually moved us forward, and perhaps back in the day of the Windhoek Declaration we were more clear about where we stood and what needed to be done and what the expectations and what the mechanisms were. Having said that, of course, we've heard great examples of instances where members of the family, the institution as a whole, have helped to maybe add a little bit of, get a bit granular on the Charter with the media freedom principles, with the Latimer House principles and guidelines. You can see instances where the network is helping to actually animate the Charter and help the institution as a whole be true to the values to which it aspires. I think that was something that hadn't occurred to me before, but I think was brought out quite clearly in some of the presentations. I think the three things that I would take away is that when we would have had this discussion maybe 5 years ago, a discussion on values would have been an opportunity to stick the boot into one particular government. That's not the case, actually. This afternoon, we've heard several instances of governments and member states across the association, whether they're in the global north or in the global south, of contraventions of fundamental what we would call Commonwealth fundamental principles. I think that's significant, and it represents, I think, a shift in the discourse within the institution on the observation of our values. I think we've heard quite strongly also, not just in this afternoon session, but throughout the morning, of the need to strengthen the Commonwealth institutions if it is really going to step up to the mark. And that's, Indrajit flagged that first off in relation to the Commonwealth's offer in relation to development. But I think throughout the day we've heard the need to strengthen not just the Secretariat and the Human Rights Unit, I would say that, wouldn't I, but other aspects and manifestations of the Commonwealth as they help the institution be true to these principles. I think the third and final thing to say is that we've also had throughout the day an urging of the need to broaden the discussion, to take it outside member states, to actually build a movement across the Commonwealth in support of values and principles. And again, you can see the value of the network in helping to animate those principles and values.